So I'm Lisa Goffman. I'm on faculty at Collier Center for Communication Disorders and the Communication Sciences and Disorders area. I'll tell you in a second what I study, but let me go ahead and let the rest of the panel introduce themselves, and it's also a great time to do a mic check. So.
All right, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, good. My name is Raul Rojas. I'm also faculty here at UT Dallas. I also work at the Collier Center for Communication Disorders with Lisa and with Mandy. I'm part of the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences with a lot of these folks, including Megan and Margaret. I study children. I specifically focus on bilingual children. And I'll be talking about those kids in a little bit.
Perfect, thank you.
I'm Mandi McGuire, and I'm also at the Collier Center as part of the faculty at UTD, also affiliated with the Center for Children and Families. I study, so as Kathy said, I had studied with her how young children learn words, and I've kind of moved that up to grade school now, and looking at how the same factors that are influencing vocabulary development in young kids, how those snowball as kids get older, and how that impacts their vocabulary development when they reach grade school. And I use behavioral measures, and some looking at how the brain is processing information to kind of look at the long-term effects in vocabulary development of a lot of the same things Kathy was talking about today.
Hi, my name is Swanson. Can you all hear me? Good. All right, we'll get this a little bit louder. There we go. I'm an assistant professor in psychological sciences in the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences here at UT Dallas. I'm also a faculty affiliate at the Center for Children and Family, and I'm an autism researcher, so I'll be talking in a little bit more about how conversational duets go awry in autism.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to kind of introduce what kind of the focus of this panel right now. Thank you so much for the lovely presentation, Kathy, about how language input to children, including responsiveness to conversation, rich vocabulary input, the duet that you eloquently spoke about, contingency, and other factors, 6 of them in fact, contribute in critical ways to children's development. As you noted already, each of us on this platform studies groups of children who may be acquiring language differently for a range of reasons. So what our panel's going to do is we're going to I'm going to talk for about a minute, and then others will talk just a few minutes about how the children and families they study may benefit from early experiences with language and social communication, perhaps in similar and perhaps in some different ways than have been discussed already. So what we've asked the panel to really think about is if there are specific considerations about language input and interaction that may differ in the children that each of you focus on and that I focus on compared with typical learners. And critically, how may you think about optimizing development based on modification of the input in the learners that you study? So as I said, I'm not a panelist here. I'm more going to be moderating and taking questions. But I can't resist the opportunity to mention my group because I think there are some really special considerations that came to mind as I listened to Kathy's talk. I study children with developmental language disorders, known as DLD, also known as specific language impairment. These children actually have particular difficulty with things like statistical learning, with things like form pattern learning that affects sound learning and grammatical learning. So are there special components? Should some of these interventions be especially tailored for these children? So that's a question I want to pose. As I mentioned, we're each going to talk for just a little while and then open it up to the whole room. Many of you, NICU, many of you study special populations, and so hopefully this will introduce you to some of the things happening here at UTD and extend the conversation to some other groups of children. We're going just in alphabetical order today, so I'm going to turn it over to Mandi now to begin.
Hi, okay, thanks. So like I said, I'm studying more kids in grade school, so older kids. My kids are typical language learners, but we're looking at kids from low and high income homes. And really what we find is these effects of the early environment with the conversations kids are having that lead to vocabulary development and vocabulary development differences. actually become larger in grade school. So kids who enter school with lower vocabularies due to environmental factors within the home, it's not that they get into school and get into a formalized setting and that gap either stops growing or becomes smaller. In fact, it becomes larger. And there are very few people studying why, and really specifically looking at what's happening in those schools or what's happening within the families that could be leading to this. One of the things that we've really found in our data is there is a big emphasis on reading, and that makes a lot of sense. Reading is very important. I think just like Kathy had said, what gets lost is this building the language and building the vocabulary, and now how that can lead to better reading. So some of what we find is what's a very typical kind of word learning task for a grade schooler, where you hear this sentence, there's a word in it you don't know the meaning of, you have to use the surrounding language to figure out the meaning. Kids from low-income homes, even if they know all the language surrounding it, perform worse at that task than kids from higher income homes. And the biggest predictor of this, even though it's a written task, is not their reading abilities or their decoding abilities, it's their vocabulary. So they know those words, but somehow their depth of knowledge and the deep understanding of those words and the ability to link those words to other information is becoming problematic and is a hindrance to vocabulary growth when they're 8, 9, 10, all the way up to 15. And this is how you build all your academics, right? This is what you need to learn science. This is what you need for social studies. And I think all of it goes back to those early features of speaking with the parents, speaking with the teachers in the preschools, and building that foundation. And it really, we're finding it really is a long-term snowball effect. And I'm open to ideas of how to fix it. We just found it's still more of a problem. I haven't fixed it at all. So I need some of Kathy's inspiration on how to fix problems, but I'm good at identifying problems. So that's what we're working on right now.
Thank you. Raul, you will take the floor.
Sure. So I mentioned really briefly that I work with bilingual children. So my background is as a speech-language pathologist, and I worked for a couple of years, like some of us did with kids before going back to get our PhD because we were crazy. And you know, I've kind of studied. I'm very interested in essentially how kids who are learning two languages, how their language develops over time, and what kinds of variables tend to almost sort of explain differences in how kids learn two languages over time, because the kids are very variable. I think with regard to what we heard this morning from Kathy, some of it, and I think it's one of those things that I know I learned this from my mentor who also works with Kathy. Some of this is a little bit of common sense, right? So we have lots of work that shows us that the degree of language exposure or input for bilingual kids, if they get more language exposure in language A than language B, they tend to show better vocabulary skills and grammar skills in language A than language B. So some of these things are pretty straightforward. I think with bilingual kids, the thing that we have to keep in mind is, I think with most populations, is this quality of early language exposure interaction is really important. And I think bilingual kids present a unique sort of set of children because they're learning languages under really unique, I guess, environmental sort of demands, right? So in the United States, there's this big push, obviously, to teach kids English in the schools, and we know that that's the case pretty much everywhere. But there's different ways to do it, right? And so one of the things that we study in my lab is how the early dual language development of these kids relates to multiple things. It can relate to things like academic achievement. It can relate to things like executive function skills, like self-regulation, some of the work I've done with Margaret. And how those two things vary in two languages. So we primarily study kids who speak Spanish and English. And I think what's really important to remember with bilingual kids is that not all bilingual kids learn two languages from birth. Some kids do. We call it simultaneous bilingual kids. But there's many, many kids who they're learning one language first, and then they start learning a second language later in life, usually when they get to school. What does that mean? I mean like systematic learning of that language. And we see differences, definite differences with those kids, because we're talking about this whole process of basically developing language, and these kids basically have to do it twice, but at different points in time, right? So what we have found is that if kids have a very strong language foundation in one language, when they have to learn the second language, it usually helps them. The kids that have a weak language foundation in that first language, when they have to learn a second language, sometimes we see differences with those kids, right? It hinders them to some degree. Now, all kids, there's lots of work with infants showing that basically we're all essentially wired to learn many languages, right? So they've done studies with infants. I haven't done this work, but other people have, where it's very clear that infants can process languages from different typological families, so on and so forth, and eventually babies kind of start narrowing their perceptual focus and attention to one language or multiple languages. And I think as far as thinking of like unique challenges, like you were saying, Lisa, one of the things that I find, and I found this when I worked as a clinician, I find it now as a clinical researcher, I often get the question from parents who are raising kids who may not be bilingual when they're 2 or 3, but they're gonna have to become bilingual because they're gonna have to learn English. Parents will say, I went to the doctor, my doctor said I have to speak in English to my kid, but I don't really know English, so I'm just making it up. And I'm like, okay, yeah. So that's not great, right, obviously. But for parents, I mean, we talk about it, and once we talk about it, I think it makes a lot more sense to them, but it's a common sense thing, right? So apart from doing what Kathy said, I think for those of you who work with kids who speak other languages other than English at home and when they're really young, have the parents essentially communicate with the kids in the language or languages that they're actually comfortable with. Don't have them communicate in a language that they have negligible proficiency in. That just doesn't make sense, but it's a recommendation often given, and I've heard it from professionals too, not just doctors, but sometimes folks who I think should know better. So I'll start with that, and then we'll discuss more things. Yeah.
And we'll open it up so you can ask questions of everybody in a few moments. But Megan, I'd love to hear from you now.
Yeah, thank you. So as I mentioned, I'm an autism researcher. So I study autism in the first few years of life, really birth to 3. And these are kids that often have difficulties with social communication. Oftentimes they have difficulties with language as well. So they might meet language milestones later in life or have general deficits in language. Those things can look very different in school-age kids. Maybe they have issues with pragmatic language, for example. But these kids also present with repetitive and stereotyped interests. So they may really like a small number of things, and they may have a really hard time disengaging from the things that they really, really like. So to tell you a little bit about kind of the challenges with supporting language in these kids, I want to take you back to my start in the field. So I actually started working on an intervention. It was a parent-mediated intervention designed to build capacity in parents and help facilitate parent-child play in toddlers with autism. So I spent a whole lot of time in families' homes watching parents play with their kids, helping them to brainstorm about strategies that they could use to help play be more successful. And what became kind of abundantly clear really early on to me is that even if you teach parents all of these skills like talk to your kids a lot, speak with a lot of lexical diversity, use different words, use WH questions, those sorts of things, it becomes really difficult to do those things when the return is not coming back to you in the same way. So in autism, because of the difficulties with social communication and interaction, we often find that the kids don't respond in the same way to parents' bids for attention that you would expect in typical development. So part of what we have to teach, in addition to these core things that Kathy so brilliantly laid out today, was for parents to be really darn resilient, right? So even if you're not getting that response from your kid, keep talking to them. And the other thing that's really important is this idea of talking about the things that kids are interested in, right? So like I said, kids with autism have these repetitive and stereotyped interests. And I worked with this one family where this toddler with autism did a lot of flagging. So he would hold stuff up like this and look at it. And inevitably, this mom had been told that that was, a feature of autism that we should be discouraging, right? So don't respond to those sorts of things. Don't encourage that behavior. And we took a very different approach in this intervention, and our goal was to have parents join their kids in play. So we told her, you know what, is there anything really bad happening? The kid's not hurting himself. It's not self-injurious behavior. it's maybe limiting his social interactions, but maybe you could try joining him. Maybe you could try talking about that object that he's holding up. And this was like a watershed moment for her and really opened up the door and gave her an avenue to play with her child. So, you know, there are these unique considerations in kids with autism, both from the social communication impairments that we see, and also due to their tendency to have restrictive and repetitive interests. Yeah.
So thank you. So this is really meant to be an introduction to what we work on, and really what we would love to have happen now is to open this up to ask questions of the panel or bring up populations of your own. I think the point is to attempt to integrate what we learned from Kathy with tailoring both early and later input for some of these kinds of learners. At least that's one starting point. So I'm going to just open it up and let you start to ask questions of any of us or each other. This is our discussion period. So give it a moment.
Well, we have.
We have one here. Try to watch all of you.
Hello, my question is for Raul.
Oh.
So when we talk about kids who are learning, let's say English and Spanish for simplicity, so what is the best way to teach them both languages at the same time? I've heard that, you know, this kind of Spanglish back and forth within the same sentence is bad. I've heard proposed methods of one parent speaks English only and the other parent speaks Spanish only. Or I've heard within bath time is only in Spanish, meal time is only in English, car time is only in Spanish. Do we have any research to support one of these methods over the other?
Okay, so yeah, thank you for your questions. I'm going to try not to talk too much, but the things that you're asking are questions that many families have. And I'll try to encapsulate it in an example from my own family, right? So my brother married, his wife is from England, and she speaks Spanish, and he speaks English, right? And so when they had their first kid, which was like 8 years ago now, this whole issue of language came up because, you know, she really wanted the kids to learn English from England, right? And they live in Boston. And then my brother wanted his kids to learn Spanish, and ideally kind of Mexican Spanish, right? It's a very specific dialect of Spanish. And he asked me these same questions. And he said, we have this plan. We read this book, and this is what we're going to do, and I want to know what you think about it. And he says, Maya's only going to talk to the kids in English, and I'm only going to talk to the kids in Spanish. And do you think that that will, you know, kind of help? His name's Alejandro, my little nephew. Will that help him to be like fully bilingual, right? And to not get confused, because that's something else that often comes up, this whole issue that bilingual kids might get confused if they hear multiple languages. So I told him that they could try it, but that I didn't think it was going to work exactly like they thought it was going to work. And I told him why, and I don't think he believed me, so they tried it anyway. And then they tried it maybe for like a month, and then they stopped because they realized it was impossible to keep up. And so the reason why it's impossible to keep up is because the parents themselves are going to talk to each other in one language or another language, right? And then when they have friends over, when they go to the supermarket, when they go to the post office, they're going to talk in some language or another, right? So kids realize this really early on, right? They realize, okay, mom and dad both speak English, and mom and dad both speak Spanish. So eventually their kids are going to demonstrate probably a preference, right? And growing up in Boston, what they started noticing is that when he was really little, when he was 3 and was already speaking quite a lot, he was basically not wanting to speak Spanish, right? And because the only person who was speaking in Spanish to him was my brother, right? And so everybody else, right? His friends, everyone else spoke English. And so now he's in a dual language school, and it's gotten way better. But the idea here is there's not one perfect way to do it. I think that's what I want to communicate to you. I think the most important thing is, again, going back to these principles that Kathy talked about, which those of us who are speech-language pathologists in the audience, and I know that there's some of us in the audience, those principles are things that we try to do in therapy all the time. So we know that they're super important, right? But I think for parents, it's really important to kind of think, again, I think it's a very common sense, think at a very basic level, right? And sort of think, what's important is the quality of your communicative interactions with your children. Thinking that one parent speaking in one language and the other parent speaking in the other language, that's going to, that the child is going to develop bilingually just because of that is probably not going to be the case. The child's going to have opportunities for, they need to have opportunities for exposure and use in both languages. So that's kind of like a small anecdote. And I think you might have asked me other questions. Oh, the code switching piece, the switching languages. So code switching is interesting. A lot of people have studied it. I think the overwhelming evidence behind code switching is that there's actually nothing wrong with it. Code switching demonstrates the ability for bilingual folks, and I code switch when I speak with my brother a lot, but when I speak with my parents, I don't code switch at all because they don't speak English, right? But it demonstrates the ability to essentially be able to abide by the rules of both languages, right? The syntactic rules, the phonotactic rules of both languages, and you're doing it simultaneously without violating the rules of the other language. There's some work potentially with kids who might start showing a decline in one language versus the other language as they're learning two languages. Some kids may show a decline in one language and not the other, and then you might see a real big difference in code switching. So code switching ideally is, you tend to find a pretty comparable proportion across languages, but sometimes you will have some kids where if they become, let's say, very strong in English, and they start essentially regressing or declining in their Spanish, when they're asked to talk in Spanish, they might code switch all the time to English, but when they're asked to talk in English, they barely code switch, right? And so that's something that we're actually studying in my lab. One of my doctoral students, Lindsay Hebert, she's here. She's studying not necessarily code switching, but that potential process of language decline in some kids when there's not support for both languages. So that's a lot, but sorry. Yeah, mouthful.
Thank you, Raul. Any responses, follow-ups, or other directions to go? Any other questions, comments? There's somebody over here.
Is that me?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
You will be next.
That's fine.
Sorry.
Sorry, so mine, I feel like kind of extends right off of that question, but it is more for all of you guys. But I don't know. So I'm curious, right, about how like then we address kids who are developing language atypically, whether it's with disorders, delays, SES differences, or specifically maybe kiddos with autism too, who are being exposed to two languages. How do we potentially, want to alter the input for them, or not at all? Let's see you shaking your head.
So I'm happy to talk about that too. So there's a select number of people, I would say, in the country who are studying specifically bilingual kids that are also a clinical population from a very specific clinical population. So for example, kids with Down syndrome, kids with autism. And what we have found in that work is that, this is a different sort of clinical population, but let's say that kids with hearing impairment who have cochlear implants, right? And what we have found in all of these populations is that what we have to remember is whether a kid's monolingual or bilingual or multilingual, they're language learners of language, right? So sometimes you will hear recommendations, I'll address that in a little bit, but I'll kind of go back to what we see as far as the overall sort of mountain of evidence that we're starting to see is that these kids, even though there's some kind of impairment, and it might be an impairment in the language acquisition, or the process of language acquisition, they're perfectly capable of still learning both languages. And in fact, when one language is suppressed, because sometimes people think, and I think people want to help the kids, they think, well, it's going to be too hard for them because they have an impairment, so we should just teach one language, right? So for many of these kids, there's a mismatch between the language that the therapist wants to teach or wants to help with and the language that the kid knows, right? And so yeah, these kids have impairments in language acquisition, but think about this. So if this is a child who has some degree of skills in language A, and then you come in as a therapist and you say, okay, I'm only going to work with you in language B because it's going to be easier for you and because this is the language you have to learn, you're essentially not leveraging all of the skills that the kid has in language A, right? So you're going to probably introduce a phase of really ineffective therapy where essentially you're not allowing the kid to help him or herself and help you as a therapist by ignoring the language skills that they do have.
And I want to add a little point to that, and that is, again, in our lab, which Kate is in. Thanks for the question, Kate. We study children with developmental language disorders, and these children maybe do approach language learning differently from the very start, bilingual or monolingual. So these children presumably have difficulties with that statistical learning, Jenny Safran task, even from the time that they are very, very young. So an issue is perhaps differentiating those kinds of learners who, again, may need different kinds of tailored input from the time they're very young, ideally, from children who are just getting maybe degraded language exposure. And I think that differentiating those kinds of children is very important. I don't know if others agree, but that's, yeah. Any other? Okay. You're up.
Am I on? Okay. So I want to follow up on something that Kathy brought up during the talk about parents not wanting to be told what to do, right? As a parent and as a researcher, I so empathize with that struggle. And so I'm hoping that our panelists can speak a little bit about the issue of messaging. Raul, you mentioned that a pediatrician may say, you can't do this, or you should do this. Megan, you did the same thing, don't join your child in play. So I'm wondering if you all could kind of brainstorm out loud about solutions to effective messaging and where that messaging needs to come from to help facilitate these communication foundations.
Thanks. Good question. Megan, who would like to start?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'll maybe take a stab at it first. So historically, autism research has certainly used a deficits-based approach, right? So we talk about the things that these kids don't do and where they show deficits. And I think more and more these days we're trying to approach things as a strength-based approach. And I certainly take a strength-based approach to my own work looking at caregivers and parents. I think messaging is really important. So when we've worked in the past doing early intervention with these kids, we would model play with kids and then ask parents what they saw and what worked and what didn't work. And that's a really different approach than asking parents to play with the kid themselves and then me telling them what worked and what didn't work. And there you also have the opportunity to really target the behaviors that you're trying to work on in that session. So maybe I'm seeing a parent who is being really directive and switching, trying to change the child's attention, and I can do that a whole bunch in a session and see how the interaction crashes and burns, and parents pick up on this pretty quickly. So yeah, I think this is something that I'm actually extremely sensitive about. There's a really dark history in autism where for a long time, parents were told by professionals, including physicians and therapists, that this is like back in the 60s and 70s, that their kids had autism because they didn't love them right and because they were cold parents. And so being a researcher who's looking at caregiver behaviors certainly requires a lot of sensitivity on my part. At the same time, I think that parents are incredible change agents. And I think that parents ultimately want to provide their children with the most nourishing, enriching environment that they can. And if there's strategies that we can help them realize to facilitate those goals, then most parents are going to do that. So I think messaging is really important, and you know, keep in mind when I was doing this intervention, I was like a 23-year-old in New York with no kids. I mean, like, what did I know about parenting a child with autism, right? So it was really important to be sensitive about those things and how we talk to parents. And I think if we are too negative, then absolutely, no one likes being criticized, right? Like, let's just get that on the table. So the messaging is important and should be done sensitively, and I think that there are clever ways to teach parents things without directly teaching them things.
Anyone else want to address it? Nancy?
Do you want to
Yeah, I just want to chime in for 1 sec. I hope I can be heard. Which is, I just think you made the most important points ever. And so I want to yellow highlight 2 of them.
Thank you.
I wanted to yellow highlight 2 of them. The first is that you actually mentioned here, have parents reflect on. And the reflect on is turning out to be really important. There's some beautiful studies right now, like Alan Mendelssohn's and stuff, where they're showing kids interacting with their parents at a well visit, okay? And just after the well visit, a nurse practitioner meets with the mom and kid, and they play like a little game, and then they reflect on it and ask the parent what she sees and use that, or he sees, sorry, and they use that as a way to help really elevate what's going on. I love your comment about the positive, you know, looking for the positive. But I want to suggest one possible twist, which you hinted at, but I'm going to just say it so bluntly. I have a son who's in the field of entertainment, and when he looks at what we do, he often thinks that one of the things we miss in our field is that we do too much telling and not enough showing. And he said that if we could move to a show instead of a tell, that we would go a lot farther in having information stick without being derogative to anyone. So you kind of said that in all of your examples, but I'm going to add his voice here to say show, don't tell.
So I'd like to also piggyback on exactly what Kathy talked about when someone talked about messaging. Oh, you were asking about the messaging piece. So, you know, in my experience working with children and families, you know, I worked in the schools, in the public schools, and that's like a very unique environment to do therapy in. But I also did home-based intervention where I would go to parents' homes and do the intervention at home. And again, these are all kids with language impairment, bilingual kids. And the showing piece is huge in our field. We have to do it. We have to show parents, we have to model for parents. So that's part of it. And part of it is also increasing the awareness. So some of the things that we sometimes might do as therapists is we will model certain behaviors or certain sort of strategies for parents. And when the parents see the kids behave in a different way, sometimes for parents, they're like, oh my God, I didn't know my kid could do that. And that's like a huge wake-up moment for parents. And I think the awareness piece is also really important because sometimes if you record parents and then you are able to then play back what the parents are doing, sometimes parents are like, my God, I can't believe I've been doing that, right? And sometimes just seeing that, kind of like being able to step away from yourself and seeing what you're doing is sometimes extremely impactful for parents. It's impactful for all of us, right? Like one time someone recorded me giving a talk somewhere and then I saw it and I was like, God, that's horrible, right? But it's one of these things that the awareness piece is really important, and then you actually showing, you know, parents how to do things, it's a huge thing that I think we're able to, that I think some therapists do, and I think it would be really great for anyone who's working with kids and families to be able to do that with people. Yeah, they'll just give them a little sheet with like bullet points, but actually like do it, right?
In an early intervention, it's really positive coaching that is
Right.
one of the most powerful approaches that many of us, I think, are probably familiar with in that context.
It's huge, yeah.
And that makes, I mean, I would think with some of that, just being a parent myself, I've thought about that sometimes where I'm like, wow, if someone had videotaped that interaction with my child, someone might take my child from me right now. But I think there is something to that in just seeing yourself and taking that step back, but then also doing it in a way that isn't overly preachy, right? So I think if you can just view yourself, sometimes you can see things without someone even needing to guide it from that point and give that information back. So that awareness and letting people see it.
Thanks wonderful question. Now, yeah. Here comes the mic. Yeah, it's right there. There you go.
Okay, back when I was the home visitor, I used to see, and I was just a generalist, I used to see kids with autism. One thing that worked great with them was teaching them infant massage, teaching the parents infant massage, because it was play, and it was the parent and the child together, face to face, with some special techniques I was taught by speech therapists that just kind of woke up the child, but also the parent was getting feedback from the child, and there was no having to tell. It was just teaching infant massage. It wasn't do this or do that, but look what we can do together, and look what the child does when you're massaging their fingers and talking about their fingers. It's just a technique where you don't have to tell them. It's play.
Great, and I want to add, Rana Abuzayo and Amanda Seidel are doing some really lovely work on the role of touch. So when we talk about statistical learning, we tend to focus on the auditory and visual systems, but for really young babies, it turns out that touching being correlated with some of the language input is a very powerful cue that I think has great implications for some of our at-risk learners as well, so.
I have a question.
Candace.
So this has been really interesting. One thing that has come to mind through some of the discussion today is the Matthew effect, which has been found for reading. My basic understanding of it is the idea that as you get to elementary school and move through elementary school, the difference between the stronger readers and the weaker readers grows larger and larger. And it sounds like that's an issue that Mandy's seeing mirrored in her work with vocabulary. And I'm wondering if the others have seen that sort of issue where you see differences when they're really small, they get stronger or bigger and bigger and bigger as kids get older. If you've seen it, and then if we can do something about it to help with those kids that are on that lower trajectory.
So that's a great question. I think there are so many things that go into that. So the Matthew effect tends to really be related to SES for a large portion of how it's studied, but it is that idea that you come into school and the differences we see get larger and larger. And there's multiple things that play into it, and so far I don't think there have been really effective ways of managing it on a global level. Part of the problem is the kids' schools are usually not as strong either. The environments that they're coming from are still not as strong. Some of what we've tried to look at is just the general learning, and I think what my approach would be this idea of building the language instead of looking too much at reading skills and some of these other things. If we can have fun, interactive ways to build language in young kids and see that as a positive, not necessarily rote memorization of vocabulary terms, but just building this foundation of language in multiple ways that can lead to some of the other. And we know that the higher your vocabulary, the better your reading comprehension. So this works kind of reciprocally, and I feel like in education, they focus too much on the reading to help build the vocabulary, where now you're dealing with two problems, right? You have low language, and you have low reading skills, and now we're forcing reading, instead of going in where we could just focus a lot more on building a language foundation to help build that, which I think would then build in all these other academic areas. But it is a multifaceted problem, which becomes really problematic because there's also things of having support systems within the community and other features that can help the kids. I'm not sure that I answered it.
Yeah, so I think this is something that we talk and think about in autism a lot as well, right? And I think I can kind of harness Dante Cicchetti from University of Minnesota at ICD and his ideas on developmental psychopathology. There are these developmental pathways, right? So a concrete example in infants and learning language is we know that early orienting skills, so just being able to shift your attention to different places, helps build language, right? Because if you can shift your attention to the apple that mom's pointing at and saying apple, then you can have that appropriate label map. So in autism, one of the ways that we've been thinking about this is intervening even earlier, right? So instead of waiting until kids are 3 or 4 or 5 and trying to build up their language skills, we intervene during infancy and support their early orienting skills and early joint attention skills. So we certainly see the same kind of compounding and divergence of skills in autism, and I think a lot of us think that it's just because there's this cascading developmental effect that kind of, it's like a snowball that gets bigger and bigger as it rolls down the hill, right?
Yes. Question over here.
Hi there. Me? You?
The mic's up, yeah, right here. Here comes the mic. You guys are getting your. Thank you.
Thank you guys for taking the time to talk to us and educate us. It's really an honor to be here. My question is, I have worked with public schools, and I've actually been a product of a low socioeconomic home and learning 2 languages, and that was a doozy. Luckily, I came out on the other side, but is Texas or the education system in general doing anything to cater to these 2 different communities? Because I feel like there's a streamlined way that we're trying to teach everyone. And so if kids from a low socioeconomic background learn differently, then what are we doing to help these kids learn better, as far as like how we test them, as far as how we teach them, and those things?
So that's a great question.
Profound.
I'll answer what I can of it. Other people who are in public education may have more specific answers. One I would say is it's not necessarily different learning, right? It's just that they're coming in, and not everybody, right? Like Kathy had said, there's a huge variability in this. So there are some kids who are coming in with that are school ready, but it is more likely within a low SES population that you're not when you get in there. And I think the problem isn't so much that they're learning differently, that they don't have the skills when they're sitting into a classroom, a kindergarten or a first grade classroom, that are necessary to take in the information that you need. And it's partially the language skills because of all the things we talked about today. It's also some of the just executive function, the ability to sit still, and self-regulation, and some of those other things that, for a bunch of, again, environmental factors that are related to differences within the home on average, make it harder to sit in a classroom and learn. And so some of those are skills. Some of what they are doing in DISD, which I know about, is part of it is early education, right? Getting kids into pre-K education that is free and available and provided in a way that works with the families. So not 2 hours, of free education, but actually having free education for pre-K. And they're doing that more and more in the Dallas schools. They've opened up a lot more of it. It's still relatively limited, but they are trying to make it where the priority is low-income families to get them into those schools. And really, they just don't have the resources to expand it as much as they want to, but that's been a big push. I know with bilingualism, they are trying to do more and more of the magnet schools that are immersion schools, where the English speakers and the Spanish speakers are having half their day in English and half the day in Spanish. Not all schools are doing that, but some of the schools within DISD are doing that with the idea that it benefits both groups of kids, right? And it puts kids at more of an equal playing field, where if part of the information you're getting is not in your primary language and we're all learning in this together. It also values the native language that the kids are speaking when they come into the home instead of devaluing that language. I know those are the things I know of that they're doing. And I think some of it is the earlier you can get the kids the skills that they need and learning those skills, then we shouldn't have to adjust things later, or there would be less adjustment later that needs to happen when they're in the schools. But part of it is just early skills of language, some numerosity, learning about numbers, and then some of these self-regulation skills that are really necessary in the classroom.
So I agree with everything that Mandi said, and I kind of want to, I want to add on a little bit to that. I think one of the real key clarifications that Mandi made is that I don't think there's any real evidence that a kid from a low socioeconomic status, let's assume from birth, and the kid's typically developing, meaning there's the cognitive system's intact, the auditory system's intact, so on and so on and so forth. That for some reason, their process of learning or their ability of learning is any different, right? I think, and tell me if I'm misrepresenting what your work, some of the work, the things you're finding. What Mandy's looking at is fast forwarding when these kids are like young adolescents or preteens, right? What has happened downstream when I think some of the conditions for learning are different, right? And I think that's really important, right? These conditions for early learning. You know, we often, meaning like bilingual speech pathologists, we often work with parents who work, both parents work 2 jobs. So the kid is bouncing around somewhere, but there's not necessarily someone who's there with the kid all the time to guarantee that all these things are happening without some explicit sort of someone coming in and saying these things are really important, right? Because for these parents, what's really important is putting food on the table, right? That's like the most important thing. And so is it a challenge? I think it's a real challenge, right? And so someone brought up this issue with the Matthew effect, right? So in some of the work that I've done, I have seen these kind of small differences translate into things that widen over time, right? So with bilingual kids, it's a little bit unique, right? We tend to see that with their English. We don't see it as much with their Spanish, meaning the kids who are starting out with higher Spanish skills tend to maintain them. The kids who are starting out with weaker Spanish language skills they're probably the ones who tend to lose them, right? But all kids eventually learn English, right? So, and then there's a lot of concern with it, but the reality is they do. And I think one of the things that will be really interesting, and you know, Mandy and I have talked about maybe hopefully doing this one day, which is there clearly is resilience in kids from low SES backgrounds, right? So some of the data that we've been working with is in a school that's in Oak Cliff, and some of you know about it. It's called Momentous. And the kids in the school are primarily low income, and you're collecting data from these kids, right? And so you see how unique that school is, right? So they have concerns now because now they're starting to wonder whether it's important to also kind of focus on their Spanish because it's an English immersion school. But I think that they have a whole approach to the curriculum which is very unique and different, right? They focus on mindfulness, self-regulation, so on and so forth. The teachers are like highly trained, right? You've got 90% of the kids are low SES, right? They're about 90% Hispanic. Most of them are Spanish speaking. And yet they do really well when they leave the school, right? So the idea is just because you're low SES doesn't necessarily doom you to potentially, so Manny and I have talked about it, and it's like, well, what if some of these kids, if we were to test them on some of the things that Mandy does, right? If we see that their neurological activity indicates that they learn once they're 8 or 9 years old, that they're learning differently, but they're still performing really well, right? Then that kind of brings into question, well, should they be performing well? And if the answer is yes, that means that we need to obviously delve deeper, right? And to figure out like what actually helps, right?
And that's, yeah, so some of what I hadn't mentioned, there are these long-term effects that we see in terms of neurological development, and that is some of what I study as well, is if you're raised in a low-income environment, a very low-income environment, are there differences in the way the brain is processing information? And usually all due to potentially environmental differences, like the input of language, like we had talked about, but also nutritional differences, same thing with poor stability within the home, if you don't have a stable environment to be in, and that could lead to at some point, differences in learning that we get to. And so that's some of what we'd like to look at, where there are kids who are doing really, really well, and maybe some of those kids are using compensatory processes that are incredibly effective within that group, in which case maybe that's something we should really harness, and there should be a way that you could look at these compensatory processes and identify ways to use that to supplement the learning or really help kids who are potentially at risk but are incredibly resilient and doing well. And especially with the group that Raul's been studying, there are kids who are doing phenomenally well, and he has great data on identifying how are those features, how are those things developing over time, that if we could start to look at differences in the brain patterns, maybe we could get some ideas of what is leading to those differences and what those outcomes are within the groups.
Great. Are we on time? Or? We're good.
We have...
Keep going, maybe one more.
We have stuff over there.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
What age group you should recommend parents should really strive harder to have that positive quality interaction with their children to develop that
Perfect. Zero.
First of all of them, like every year. But I think starting right from, like Kathy showed, right from the beginning. I mean, when there's this interaction of just eye gaze even, and like Megan was saying, those early eye gaze and early joint attention, I mean, they really show from the beginning responsivity, like just responding to children when they cry, just responding to those cries. The more actively parents do that and respond every time the child has some form of communication, even unintentional communication, right? They're crying not because they want to get you, but because they're uncomfortable or they're hungry. The more responsive the parents are to those cries, the better the kid's language development later. So right from the beginning, it's a lot about reading what the kid needs and wants, starting with infancy. And I think that builds a foundation not only in the kids, but in the parents, right? You learn that as I respond to the kids, I get positive feedback from that. The kids smile, the kids engage, they get better and better at engaging with me. And so I think right from the beginning, that responsivity and learning that beginning that, I think there's this same old wives' tale, like, oh, don't go to them every time they cry or else they're just going to get spoiled and they'll never learn to talk. And that's absolutely the opposite of what happens, even from that beginning crying stage. So it's just learning that any form of communication, you want to start responding to that, and that will not only ingrain in the child the importance of communication, which will build a foundation for it, but in the parents, that this helps and this is important to do as early as possible. And then I think it's something that continues from that point on. That's my...
I was just going to say the same kinds of things that Mandi just so elaborately stated to us, and I appreciate that, Mandi. But contingency, and that Kathy brought up, is so very important, and that's what Mandi's talking about. And I just wanted to mention there was a study done years and years ago by my graduate mentor, Tony DeCasper, with newborn babies. The babies were 24 to 48 hours of age. And DeCasper had developed a sucking technique that if babies sucked on a pacifier, they would hear a voice or music. And he did one study, and I cannot remember the journal in which it's published, but he did a study in which babies learned that they could hear music by sucking on the pacifier. So one group of babies learned they could hear the music. Another group of babies just heard music presented randomly in a yoked condition. The babies came back 12 to 24 hours later in the same procedure. The babies who had learned that they could control the music now were in a situation where they could no longer control it. And those babies got upset and cried. The babies who in the first situation learned that they had control of the music, who didn't have control, so then the other babies did not have control the first session. They came back the second session. Now they were able to control turning on the music by their sucking. They did not learn it because they had already learned that in this specific situation, what they did had an effect on their experience. And then they didn't even try to learn it or were unable to learn it 12 to 24 hours later. So this idea of contingency that we've talked about, it feeds into so many of their interactions. The joint focus of attention, moms are paying attention to what the babies are paying attention to. It's a contingent responsiveness. So I just think that's an incredibly important phenomenon that we all need to be thinking about and be ensuring that contingencies are part of all of our interactions.
Yeah, Lisa, if I can just add something really quick to that. So I'm going to highlight what I think is actually one of the limitations in our field of child development, and I'd love to hear Kathy's thought on this. So, it's one thing to tell parents, like, be mom 3 all the time, but that's pretty overwhelming for them to hear, and no one's going to be a super parent. So part of what I think we need to do is better understand what are the key ingredients at different times, right? So some of my understanding of the literature is that things like infant-directed speech, so simplifying your language in the first months of life helps them learn language, right? Because they're babies, they have baby brains, they're just figuring things out. But then as infants get older, using more variety of language, so having more lexical diversity is better. And then as they get around the age of 2 or 3, using a lot of WH questions, get them a little bit more inquisitive, right? So these are who, what, where, when, those sorts of questions. So I actually don't know how much we've really figured out this developmental sequence of what is the key ingredient to supporting language in kids, but I think it's something that researchers hopefully are working on, but these require really well-characterized longitudinal studies where we follow individual babies over a long period of time, and that's time-intensive and difficult work to do. But I think that is one of the limitations in the field right now.
So I would add to that, one of the things that I think helps is if you take one key piece of information, I think it is follow your child's lead. And some of that gets to those, right? So, right, at a young age, it's talking to them, and they get so excited to have you talk to them. I'll say I have a 4.5-year-old now. She doesn't actually want to listen to me talk. She wants to talk, like, all the time. And she'll ask questions, and I can ask her questions. But if I follow her lead, then I move to that next stage where now she should be talking, right? She should be leading the conversation, and then I can follow up with questions on it. And so I think there is some, if you take kind of one key piece, that it's like, what can make me a good parent or a good teacher or good throughout the child's development? A lot of it is follow your child's lead. They figure out where they are and kind of try to follow along with that. And if you're doing that and listening to them and paying attention and putting down the phone and looking them in the eye and saying, okay, what are we doing? I think you can kind of gauge that that's going to develop and change over time based on how they react to you. And I think this idea that different populations will behave differently in that case is also really important, that you should react differently, that parents' interactions with kids with autism may need to be different in different stages. And maybe by reading the kids a little bit, you can gauge that a little bit as well. And some kids may, shy away from some of these things. But I think that parent responsivity of just following the child's lead can be a key piece, that if you don't know what to do at some certain stage, start there, right? Start with, okay, what is the child interested in? What are they talking about? What do they seem to want to do? And how much do they want to talk? And if it's my kid, it's all the time. I think that's a good place to start as one key feature.
I'm starting to get afraid that we have so much to say to parents. All of this sounds wonderful, and everything sounds wonderful, and it might be overwhelming. And one thing I like to say is that, you don't start off the very second of the birth in love with your baby necessarily. You might think that's going to happen, but, you're building a relationship over time. And it's kind of like, just wait and see how your baby sucks you in, how, you explode when they smile at you, and what you're going to want to say. But maybe you're going to want to say that second one. But things develop, and it's great right now, and just wait till tomorrow. But, just enjoy it, too. You got to say that.
Or it's horrible right now and wait till tomorrow. But that's still of infancy. If it's really hard right now, wait till tomorrow. It gets better. No, that one was
Okay, I just want to add one thing. Mandy and Megan, I thought you were got it dead on there again. And following the kids' interest is just so important. And one of the things that I've noticed now that I have a 2-year-old and 4-year-old kind of around is that I actually don't know how parents survive today. No, I mean this seriously, okay? I have never seen more information shoved at parents. So last week or the week before, I can't remember, CNN called and they asked me what I thought about the new diapers. There are these new diapers that are actually measuring how much pee your kids have. Now, why do I need to know that? Why? And then I also got a call from some lady about 2 months ago. So she was very excited because she had gotten wind of some of the phonological development, which is the sound development that we sometimes study as researchers. And she said, well, parents are going to want to know what sounds their baby makes in the crib. I said, no, I don't think they will want to know that. And she said, well, I'm starting a business on it. And I said, then I'm not going to endorse it. Because I don't think we need to know if the kid is saying a buh or a puh. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just another reason to drive you crazy. And my daughter-in-law, who, as I said to you, she's wonderful, right? And she got all the message about the lying on the back and all that sort of stuff. And then an amazing thing happened. Her baby turned over. Oh, what are you going to do now? Okay, baby's no longer lying on back. So I just think sometimes we let a lot of this stuff scare us, and educators pick up on it. And I wonder if we can't tone down some of the way we, give information to parents, because I know I had 3 sons. I mean, honestly, I'm sure I want to follow all your rules, developmental psychologist, but I can't. Because I can't possibly know when I'm supposed to say what to whom when there's all 3 of them are in the room. The other thing I just wanted to say was I want to come back to your very, very good question about, you know, the learning environments and Mandy's response to that. And Mandy, again, I just think we're so on about talking about the 0 to 3 and getting started early, because we are looking at some of these brain things to develop over time, both in connectivity and in the structure of the brain. And it's just so important that we start early so this is not a problem. And starting early to me means starting early with more than one language, if you can. And for all of you who are lucky enough to speak more than one language, I also just wanted to tell you that you've already gotten a leg up, okay? A huge leg up. Because when you do that code switching that Raul is talking about, it turns out that when you use one language, you have to suppress the other language so you know which language you're talking. That's a process that many of you probably heard about. It's called executive function skills. Now, that's just the fancy title. But that's for attention and memory and planning and impulse control. And if you have more of that, then guess what? You do better in school, and it reduces Alzheimer's risk. Now, let's just talk about that. So if you happen to be from some of these environments, please, 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 I beg of you, don't think of it as a disadvantage. Don't think of it as a disadvantage. Know that it is an advantage, and that there are no lesser brains and non-lesser brains. Let's just expunge that idea for the moment. Let's start early, because evolution's way longer than the field of psychology, okay? And we know that if we kind of do the right stuff, follow the kids' lead, our kids are going to grow up and they're going to be just fine.
And on that note, I think,
We got to break for lunch.
okay, I think it's time to break for lunch. Last word. Thank you, everybody, so much. Continue this conversation informally.